Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Washington Crossing Historic Park. My name is Kim McCarty, and I am the curator here at the park, and I want to welcome you to our first lecture of our 2024 lecture series. It's going to take me a while to remember to say 24 and not 3, but welcome. Before we get started, for our guests on Zoom, I have a little bit of housekeeping to get through, so just bear with me for a moment. This session is being recorded for training and record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. At any time, if you have a question or comment, feel free to place that in the chat box and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like to ask your question or to comment verbally, please note that by doing so, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of your statements as part of this recorded session. That being said, for those of you on Zoom, if you have any questions, we're not going to have the ability for you to just say so verbally, so please just add it to the comments and we will ask. All questions will be held until the end. After we are done our Q&A, then I'm inviting everyone out into the Riverview room where we're going to have some light refreshments and the opportunity for you to have a copy of our topic today, our book topic today, Foul Bodies by Kathleen Brown. It is available in the gift shop if you're interested, and then we'll be having a little bit of a book signing afterward. Kathleen Brown is a historian of gender and race in early America and the Atlantic at the University of Pennsylvania. Educated at Wesleyan University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she is author of Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, Gender, Race, and Power in Colonial Virginia, which won the Dunning Prize of the American Historical Association. Her second book, Foul Bodies, right here, which we'll be hearing about today, received the Organization of American Historians Lawrence Levine Prize, Book Prize for Cultural History, and the Society of the History of the Early American Republic Book Prize. Foul Bodies explores the relationships among health, domestic labor, and ideals for beauty, civilization, and spiritual purity during the period between Europe's Atlantic encounters and the American Civil War. Brown is also the author of numerous articles and essays. She has been a fellow at the Omohundro Institute for Early American Studies at the College of William and Mary, the American Antiquarian Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Bunting Institute at Radcliffe College. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2015 and 2016 to support her research and writing of her most recent book, Undoing Slavery: Bodies, Race, and Rights in the Age of Abolition. Undoing Slavery excavates cultural, political, medical, and legal history to understand the abolitionist focus on the body on its own terms. Motivated by their conviction that the physical form of the human body was universal and faced with growing racism of the 18th and 19th century science, abolitionists in North America and Britain focused on undoing slavery's harm to the bodies of the enslaved. Refugees from slavery demonstrated that a person could leave the life of slavery behind, but leaving behind the enslaved body, the fleshy archive of trauma and injury, proved impossible. Bodies damaged by slavery needed urgent physical care. I'm sorry, I did that. There we go. Now, urgent physical care, as well as access to medical knowledge untainted by racist science. As the campaign to end slavery revealed, legal rights alone, while necessary, were not sufficient either to protect or heal the bodies of African-descended people from the consequences of slavery and racism, which all sounds fascinating. But today, we are here to hear about foul bodies. And with that, I want to welcome to the podium, Kathleen Brown.
Thank you, Kim McCarty, for that lovely introduction, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. I know if you were out there on some of the flooded roads, it was a little bit of a task, a challenge to get here, so thank you for being here, and I'm excited to talk to you. What I have planned today is really kind of an overview of the scope of the book with a little added epilogue, because I've had some time since I finished the book to think a little bit more about how it connects to some other issues that I've been working on. So I'm going to move at a rather brisk pace, but I'm not reading a text. I'm really just going to talk it through with you. Please, if you have questions, please feel free to bring those issues up once I've finished with the slide presentation, and I'd also be happy to talk to you afterwards. And I've got one job here besides talking, and that is I have to click 2 buttons to advance my slides. So if you see that I've failed in any of these challenges, please, wave or do something. Somebody will hopefully catch me if I make an error. So really what I want to do today is talk about a big arc of change in how people imagine what the name of it is, but it's like you could use it as a kind of a warming pan that would be the equivalent of aromatherapy in the present day. And then on the far right image, there's a man who's holding a kind of a huge tiki torch-like contraption. This was also very common. They did it in Philadelphia during the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, basically setting fires to have the smoke fumigate and purify air that was understood to be making people sick. Okay, so that's the kind of bigger sensibility about what makes you sick. What in the world is going to make you sick? And it's really the air around you. The climate could also do that. But in the meantime, there's a really long-lived tradition coming out of medieval Europe for bathing. And unlike probably many of our own ideas about, I won't even try to guess what your ideas about bathing are, but one of the things that's surprising to modern students of the history of the care of the body is how multi-purpose early modern and medieval bathing was. That it was kind of like one-stop shopping for medical care, for delousing your hair, for getting cupped to try to restore your body to health by removing toxins. You could take a good sweat in a steam bath and then plunge into cold water after, again, to try to restore a body out of balance or maintain your health. But as the younger generation would say today, it was also a scene for hookup culture, okay? It was a place where people went for sexual pleasure. They might hear music, they might eat food, they might drink wine, they would enjoy a hot bath, and then they might also find someone to have sex with. Okay, so for all these reasons, public baths, and they were also known as the stews, and that developed a kind of seamy reputation for illicit sexuality, places where prostitutes would be, but it referred to the kind of central heating of the bath. There was a place for a hot bath. For all of these reasons, baths eventually develop a bad reputation, especially during outbreaks of disease and plague. And I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, now there's an interesting footnote here about race, particularly about Blackness. And that is that although so many of the optics of cleanliness, of refinement and decency were signified with whiteness, there was a kind of wisdom about the power of nature that was exemplified through this saying about the futility of trying to turn black skin white by washing it. So in other words, the takeaway from this epigram was that black skin was not dirty. okay? It was an example of the power of nature and the futility of human efforts to change that which nature had determined. Okay, so that's kind of just an important footnote to the kind of very deeply embedded cultural meaning assigned to Blackness and whiteness. Okay, so there was bad bathing, and it becomes increasingly bad after a series of epidemics and plagues. And the Catholic Church is not keen on the traditions of bathing because they most often involve nudity and sex. But here I've just got a few examples for you of some bad bathing. For one, bathing encouraged a kind of vanity. And so there were often images of people bathing where the woman is lost in a kind of a narcissistic trance at her own beauty, looking at herself in a mirror coming out of the bath, not knowing that she's being ogled by two men. So it's kind of the beginning of a scene that could end in an illicit sexual encounter, right? So no good can come of that kind of vanity associated with bathing. But it's also associated with aristocratic corruption. Okay, the idea that only people of a certain class who have lots of attendants to be able to prepare a private hot bath and to provide a private chamber and attend to the bather, in this case, in the image on the right, a female bather, and you can barely see it, but she's actually being ogled from the side by a man who's not supposed to be looking into that space. That's one of the favorite tropes of these kinds of bathing scenes from the 16th and 17th centuries. And of course, the other downside is that if you're engaging in hot bathing, you're potentially widening the pores of the skin in ways that can let all the diseases in, okay? Because remember, if disease is just a matter of bad smells, right, bad air, opening up those pores isn't a good idea. Okay, so I'm kind of playing a little fast and loose with chronology here, but let's just take a moment. At a certain point, Columbus leads the charge of Europeans across the Atlantic. And it's not at the high point of European cleanliness. Let's just put it that way. And it is part of the way of kind of othering groups of people to disparage those groups for being dirty. It doesn't work so well with Native Americans because really by nobody's account are they dirtier than Europeans. It's pretty clear that the Europeans are the dirty ones when they encounter Native peoples. Native peoples prided themselves on plucking hair so that their skin was smooth. They applied ointments to their skin. They actually didn't do what Europeans did, which was to adorn the body through clothing. They tended to adorn the skin itself through paint and tattoos. And Europeans saw a lot of Native bodies. They tended to conflate the fact that they saw a lot of bodies with nudity, and in fact, they usually were never seeing completely nude Native bodies. But this was part of European kind of mixed response to Native peoples. On the one hand, they saw them as simple primitives, people who needed to be made more sophisticated by civilization. On the other hand, they saw them as crude barbarians, as people who didn't have the kind of gifts of health and the savvy that Europeans had. So the other part of the encounter with Native Americans was seeing women regularly perform work that refined women in Europe would not do, which is to say field work, but in many cases, there are huge differences among different Native American cultures, but in many cases, women were also the ones who were packing up housing and moving it from summer to winter grounds and then back again. Okay, so they were not really fitting that stereotype, it's not a stereotype, that understood to be a natural assignment of labor to European women as built, as based in nature on domestic labor, right? That was women's natural role. Okay, so a couple of big epidemics change the view, which was already a little sketchy, of public bathhouses and bathing. One was that Columbus's men returned with syphilis and spread it all over the place. And you can almost follow the path of syphilis from their return to Sevilla, and then points west and north and east. And everybody pretty much said, syphilis, depending on who they were, they described it as a new disease, but they also blamed other national groups. So the Italians called it the French disease, and the French called it the English disease, and so on. In fact, it probably wasn't a new disease, but it was a new iteration of an older disease, and it caused a panic. For one thing, many bathhouses closed. The ones that remained open, they now segregated men and women from each other, so these were not places for sexual pleasure anymore. And there was an association of women's bodies, sex with women, and bathing with illicit sex and disease. Okay, so in that context, linen and the uses of linen appear to be a safer way to keep the body clean and decent. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that there was a turn away from bathing, especially public bathing, to washing linen as the main way of cleaning the body. Linen next to the skin was understood by everyone, but especially by the women who did the laundry, to absorb and accumulate dirt from the body's surface, from the skin. And linen, unlike skin, which increasingly people felt was vulnerable to disease, especially in bathhouses, linen could be easily washed, okay? Or easy, especially easy to say, though, if you were not the one doing the washing. It was a better way to be clean. It had always been a technique for cleaning the body, but it became ascendant during the 18th and the 19th, the 17th and the 18th centuries and into the 19th century. And just so that you know here, so that's an image. Both of those are undergarments. And next to that image is a British African. People debate whether it is the African Olaudah Equiano, who probably was actually born in South Carolina, not in West Africa, or whether that's Charles Ignacio Sancho. Both of these men lived in England and had careers as writers, really as kind of public intellectual figures. And both of them dress themselves as fine English gentlemen. What I want you to see there is the optics of the white collar, that literally in this case, he's kind of he's whitened himself in terms of respectability by that snowy white collar. Okay, so that becomes a very important part of the presentation of the body as a clean body, a decent body, a refined body. Okay, well, without the manufacture of flax and linen, there are no linen garments. And without laundry and launderers, there's no clean linen. And without women doing the work of laundry, there's no laundry to be done. Okay, so when we try to understand then the significance of this focus on a healthy, clean, and refined body as a body clad in white linen, we have to remember there's a whole household division of labor that's producing that, okay? You know, from the actual manufacture and bleaching of linen to its washing, its regular washing, to drying it and using various devices like wringers and irons to try to get excess water out, but also to get wrinkles out of it. All of this was part of this European, what I call a linen laundry complex. Okay, so why would I call it that? It sounds like a kind of fancy way to say Europeans believed in the dressed body as a body dressed in a shirt. Well, Europeans at this point are encountering lots of people around the world who do not organize care of the body that way, do not present the body that way. And my point is that, in fact, that whole presentation of the civilized body as the body wearing that linen undergarment is a product of a whole household organization, an organization of labor, without which that body could not appear as it did. Okay, and just to give you an example, when New Englanders talked to the Native American inhabitants of New England about whether they were interested in adopting the garb and the habits of English settlers, at least one set of New England Native American men reported to English traveler William Wood that they were not interested in English shirts because, quote, their women cannot wash them when they be soiled, and their means will not reach to buy new when they have done with their old. In other words, what good is a linen shirt if you don't have the household organized to maintain it and wash it, keep it decent, keep it clean, keep it white? Okay, so by the time we get to the 19th century, there's been this turn to these linen garments, these kind of foundational garments. There's been some experiment, especially around hot springs, spa waters. In Pennsylvania, Bedford Springs is one of them. You might have heard of Saratoga Springs. There's the White Sulphur Springs in Virginia. So some people had begun a kind of tentative exploration, a re-engagement with water as a way of cleaning the body. Although honestly, when they went to these hot springs, what they tended to do was drink the water, which is actually quite a disgusting thought, considering that some people had bathed in it. But the idea was, in fact, that it would be through drinking the water that you'd be restored to health, not that you would actually necessarily put your body in the water. In any case, these are the foundational garments by the 19th century. By the 19th century, laundry in well-organized, we might say emerging middle-class households is a weekly affair. So Monday might be wash day, and there might be a bigger wash seasonally for lots of household linens. And these white garments showcase a certain kind of class privilege. They showcase an order to the household, a certain privilege of access to female labor in that household, and they also signify the wearer's refinement. Okay, so even as that is happening, though, we do see evidence of the ways people are, again, incorporating water, usually at the beginning, the late 18th century, early 19th century. We don't have a lot of evidence that very many people are fully immersing their bodies. That's for a few intrepid people willing to experiment. The Drinkers, a wealthy Quaker family in Philadelphia, experimented with a shower bath and with a tub, but they wrote about it when they did it, okay? So it's not a run-of-the-mill way to care for the body, but we see other evidence, and these are some visual sources for the importance of washing hands. The importance, that's a Mary Cassatt image from later in the 19th century of doing a kind of a sponge bath on the upper body. And then in the chambers of well-organized, prosperous households, you might see what you see there on the right, which is a chamber set, which would include water that you could wash yourself with in the morning, a chamber pot to relieve yourself at night, because most households until the 1870s or 1880s did not have indoor facilities, bathrooms, toilets. Okay, let's see. And I'll just, as I change slides, just tell you also, soap was not a product that's being used on people's bodies until later in the 19th century. That's actually why Irish soap becomes such a kind of huge hit. It's gentle enough, they claim, to be able to use it on the body, okay, as well as for the primary purpose of soap in the 19th century, which is to clean clothing. Okay, so here we are in the 19th century, and we're across the Atlantic. These are mainly images coming from North America. And the 19th century inhabitant of a city like Philadelphia or New York or Boston or Charleston faced in pretty significant public health challenges. For one, the lives of poor people were always on the edge, were always possibly going to be changed by bad luck. People were still afraid of miasmas and contagions, and early modern cities and their North American descendants, the 19th century cities I've mentioned, they smelled terrible. Municipal authorities usually were not powerful enough to be able to enforce street cleaning, to be able to rid streets of, rotting garbage, dead animals, the contents of chamber pots. Cities were also concerned to try to improve the health of denizens by strictly regulating where the tanneries could be because they made a big smell, strictly regulating where cemeteries could be because of the sense that the burial of dead bodies would itself present a health hazard. Okay. And so in these images here, one comes from earlier in the 19th century, one comes from a little bit later. We see the kind of chaos that was associated with the spread of cholera. Okay, so among the efforts at municipal cleanliness, the public health, were pretty amazing efforts to provide running water, clean running water to more households in cities. And so we have a couple of major efforts here. Actually, there was an early effort in 1799 in Philadelphia. It gets remade as the Fairmount Water Works in 1811. Philadelphia is actually at that point one of the leading cities in the new United States. And there's an early development of fire hydrants to be able to make water available to pumping engines to put out fires. The Manhattan Water Works in 1825 and the Croton Aqueduct in 1842. That image there in the bottom left comes from a guide to housewives for how to create a device that would use gravity to enable housewives to cut out the labor of having to retrieve water from an outdoor pump and to have it brought in directly into the house. Okay, all signs that bathing is becoming at least something that women in fairly well-to-do white middle-class households are interested in making possible by reducing the amount of labor involved in sourcing water. Okay, so definitely one of the keys to the changes that we see in the 19th century are these recurrent cholera epidemics. Cholera is waterborne, and people knew cholera was coming to their city because usually what happened is there'd be a report of it from a city where there was a lot of trade and traffic of people and goods, and sure enough, within weeks or months, cholera would spread to that city, that usually a port city where people had traveled. So here again, we see this optics of whiteness around cleanliness. One of the methods that was believed to achieve some protection against cholera was whitewashing households. So when you see whitewash, it wasn't just to make it look pretty and neat. It was also believed to make it more healthy, right? It was a way to reduce the possibility of disease. So people did whitewash houses in anticipation of an epidemic or in the hopes that it would pass them by. And then the image on the left is showing a variety of different methods using water in public spaces to scrub, to try to reduce filth on steps and in the streets. And in the far background there, you can see a figure kind of being run out of town, and that's cholera. Okay, so we get a lot of sense of this municipal interest in public health as a matter of public cleanliness. Okay, but indoors, it was a mess. And so it wasn't just that the outdoors risked the health of people living inside the house, is that what was going on inside wasn't that great either. People are still using chamber pots. There's no disposable diapers. There's no disposable sanitary napkins for women. There are still bed bugs. There are stagnant pools in people's yards if they are living near yards. That backyard examined is supposed to be a sketch of kind of worst case scenario of breeding grounds for disease. That's a lot of standing water. There's a privy. She's dumping things out the back. And I'm sorry, that's, yeah, rotting food and some maggots in the meat. There's a lot of sources of smell inside the house that people are none too happy about as potential health risks. Okay, and so one of the other big changes that we see in how people manage their households is that they move away from kind of a 17th and 18th century aesthetic. You might have seen it in places like Colonial Williamsburg or other historic houses, where when people went to bed at night, they pulled those curtains, right, to keep the drafts out. By the 19th century, there is a sense that fresh air, that moving air, is actually the thing that's going to keep people healthy. There's one big drawback. People are catching on to the fact that mosquitoes are really not good, that they're a source of disease. And so the trick would be to shut those windows at night, which was understood to be prime time for those mosquitoes to come into the room. But generally, we see that curtains around beddings, heavy drapes, shuttered windows, a lot of that is really opening up and is recommended in health manuals from the 19th century. It was also understood to be one of the reasons why prisons were so lethal, why public schools, there's a big movement around the air in public schools being bad. Sound familiar to anyone from the last several years? So this sort of ethos of, getting the fresh air in. Okay, and then we also get this renewed interest in bathing, in private bathing, okay? But there's some obstacles because ordinary 19th century people's houses aren't set up for bathing, for private bathing. So there are problems of labor, who's hauling all that water, who's heating the water, who's got a big receptacle for a bath, where is the bath going to take place so that a person has some privacy, and where are you getting the water from anyway? Okay, so all of these become the issues. The other thing we see, and we can kind of imagine this as a consequence of a number of the things that we've already discussed, is we see the figure of the mother, and it's a very specific population of mothers. These are white middle-class mothers who by the middle of the 19th century are having fewer children, especially if they're living in urban settings or they are connected to that urban economy more so than to the agricultural economy. They're investing in educating those children. They're really trying to maneuver a certain feat of class formation and class maintenance intergenerationally. And so the mother's body undergoes a kind of a transformation from being the source of potential contamination or filth or disease herself to being the source of order, the enforcer of that order, of hygiene, of regular bathing. And it is important for us to see here, at least the figure on the right, which is called Saturday Evening, a mother with a son at the pump, and she's scrubbing him within an inch of his life. Probably the significance of Saturday evening would be to get him ready for church on Sunday, so he'd make a respectable appearance. But then even in that top left-hand corner, you see a poem that comes from a children's book early in the 19th century for the little girl that didn't want to be washed. I don't have the whole poem there, but basically the punchline is, your dad's not going to love you or give you a kiss if you've got a dirty face, okay? So this is a discipline. And it would have been impossible for the white middle-class mother to impose this discipline if she herself was not beyond reproach, if she continued to have a reputation for filth. So we have to kind of understand some of the ways this happens. One of the ways it happens, especially in wealthier homes, is that dirty work is outsourced to hired labor. Immigrant women in the North, African-American women who have no choice because they're enslaved in the South, okay? And the notion that people doing dirty work are themselves somehow dirty is something that we can see really coming out of the 18th and 19th centuries, okay? So in this case, all of the women are showing in the photo kind of holding the tools of their trade. Probably the woman on the left with the dustpan and broom might also have been laundering, but the other part of creating a more refined white middle-class household space, I'll get to that in a second. I'll just say a word about this. If you're going to have immigrant laborers in your white middle-class household, then you're sure going to be interested in the condition of their households, okay? And so the other thing that we see is that evangelical Christians are part of a bigger effort to equate spiritual cleanliness and morality with actual physical cleanliness of the body. And so this comes from a book that was published by the American Sunday School Tract Society, and it shows the comparison of a dirty, disorderly home at the top and a tidy, clean home. And the message was, cleanliness is free. And it's a sign of a kind of convergence of morality, of being in good relationship with God, and also having a certain amount of discipline and will, okay, to keep an environment clean, which also would be understood as part of a kind of bigger effort at disease prevention, because there is also a sense, especially if immigrant women are coming into the homes of white middle-class people to do their cleaning for them, that they could bring diseases with them. Okay, that the actual smells of their body could connect the fates of people across the class divide. Wait a second, now I've lost, here. There we go. And the other big shift we see from that early 19th century, each woman in a sort of modest household struggling with the laundry by herself with some hired girls, perhaps with daughters and relatives, is the outsourcing of laundry, the most hated household task, the task that any woman would get rid of as soon as she possibly could, to African-American laundresses. It becomes a niche form of subsistence for Black households in the post-Civil War South, and in most cities in the North. Black women find their place in the urban economy by taking in laundry. And for them, it represents a chance for autonomy and independence, because they're not going to be living in with their bosses as subordinate household staff. They're going to maintain their own houses and be able to subsist by taking in laundry. Okay, but again, the association of the class position and the refinement of the person with the labor they're doing. Okay, but in this case, they're doing the work that's actually creating the refinement for the white middle class that's paying for this. Okay, and then finally, and I don't know how I am on time, but I think I'm pretty good. This is not part of the book, but it's actually part of what I teach regularly to history students at the University of Pennsylvania. If we look at this image coming from the very end of the 19th century, this is on the left, a picture of babies of immigrant mothers at Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago. Toward really, I think the exact date of the picture I'm not certain of, but it's late 1890s, early 20th century. And on the right, we have an image that comes from this political satirical magazine. That's President William McKinley during the Spanish-American War, when the United States has ambitions for conquering the Philippines. And he is rendered as a kind of a feminine figure, right? Think about those struggling children in some of those earlier images I showed you. He's the mom giving the child a bath, Okay, and in this case, the caption says the Filipinos' first bath. The child doesn't want the bath. The child is resisting the imposition of this discipline, this foreign discipline on his body. And McKinley's insisting on it, and it's part of really the bath of imperialism and civilization and conquest. Okay, and we can kind of see its lineage throughout the 18th and 19th century, where in fact, a feminine figure imposing bodily discipline upon children especially is a sort of a product of this long history of Europeans encountering Native Americans, of urbanization, of public schools, of epidemic disease patterns that shift because of all of the traffic, commercial traffic, and finally of this class and race formation of white middle class households. And so all of that is kind of lurking in this set of symbols. And I'm going to stop there and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have. And I'm realizing I didn't actually show this last slide to the Zoom audience.
Thank you. All righty, does anyone have any questions?
I don't have a question, but I have a point to bring up. At Valley Forge in the spring, when the hut started to smell, the soldiers were ordered to burn a cartridge, a black powder cartridge, in each hut once a day.
Yes, so that would have been classic fumigation of the air, right? Which again, we don't fully get what it meant to them to do that. I mean, they're really thinking, remember at the beginning of the COVID pandemic when everybody thought if they got those bleach wipes and wiped their counters, it was going to protect them? You know, I believed that fully. I did it. So they're responding to the dangers of their environment in an absolutely logical way, given how they understand the spread of disease. Yeah, so thank you for that. Kim, do I need to repeat comments like that for the Zoom audience?
Yeah.
Okay, oops.
Great talk, thank you very much. I have a question about this weekend, the Republic of Ireland, where refused to alter their constitution, removing language, placing women in the home. And so it's gone from the woman being an authority almost now a slave. Are you surprised at that? Or almost there?
I will repeat the question. So the question is about an effort at changing the wording of the Constitution of Ireland to alter references which seem dated at this point that suggest that women's proper place is in the home. And now I just need to confess, I have had several discussions with people about this without having read the actual text myself. My understanding is that it's not a simple sort of refusal to update dated language, but it has to do with the fact that the updates themselves were rejected by a kind of progressive lot that wanted to see it say something a little bit more emphatic. And I could be wrong on that. But so in other words, a kind of complicated politics for which the prime minister, I think it was, has already apologized for the failure of it. So I think there was a kind of a will to do it, and it was done in a pretty clumsy way that even the supporters of the spirit of it didn't support it.
Hi, thanks very much. I was thinking earlier in the presentation about the use of burning incense at funerals, and I wondered how you would weave that into.
Yeah, and so the question is about burning incense at funerals, which has a very long history and is a really important part of the pageantry of the Catholic Church through the medieval period and beyond, right? That in fact, people living in squalor could go into a church and see fine vestments, white linens, chalices made of fancy materials, but also smell the odor of sanctity, which had to do with incense. So it wasn't even just funerals, but it was also part of the entire spiritual purity of the experience within a church that used incense. So it absolutely fits in. And it's also, one of the interesting things about purity and pollution is how closely linked they are. So for example, linen, white linen, comes out of a process which involves rotting of flax fibers. Soap itself, before it becomes soap,